to those of you who are joining us from Central and Eastern Canada, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this discussion led by the Alberta Securities Commission about the Canadian Securities Administrators' proposals to increase transparency about diversity on boards and in executive officer positions in corporate Canada. These proposals are currently out for comment across the country, and we are encouraging the submission of feedback. We're pleased to host this discussion, which reflects our commitment to providing investors with the information they need to make informed investment and voting decisions, and we would like to thank all of you for joining us today. Above all, we hope this discussion enhances your understanding of the proposals, makes clear why this matters, and punctuates the importance of hearing from you during the comment period. Before I start the substantive matters, I'd like to indicate that Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples, including the Métis people, the Inuit, and those First Nations who reside in Treaties 6, 7, and 8 regions. I acknowledge and respect the histories, languages, and cultures of all First Peoples of Canada who have lived on and cared for these lands for generations and whose presence continues to enrich our community. In 2016, the ASC adopted disclosure requirements that require companies to disclose specific information regarding practices and policies as they relate to the representation of women on boards and in executive ranks. Most of the members of the CSA have adopted these disclosure requirements. In the years that followed, several developments occurred in Canada and across the globe that increased the focus on diversity, including in the corporate environment. These developments stimulated conversations aimed at advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion on multiple fronts. As a result, among other activities, the ASC hosted a virtual roundtable in December 2021 about the importance of diversity beyond gender on boards and in executive officer positions, and what role securities regulators could play. We heard from a group of corporate directors with varying backgrounds about the value of diversity within corporate Canada and the need for issuers to embrace it within their organizational culture. On April 13th of this year, the CSA published proposed amendments to corporate governance disclosure requirements and guidance relating to diversity. These proposals would require disclosure on aspects of diversity beyond the representation of women, while retaining the current disclosure requirements with respect to women. The CSA is seeking comment on these two approaches, each of which builds upon the current disclosure requirements. To be clear, there is much consensus amongst the CSA, including the strong belief that diversity is valuable and a commitment to providing investors with the information they need to better understand how diversity is being addressed by issuers. There are, however, different perspectives as to how this increased transparency should be achieved. On the one hand, an approach has been put forth that is grounded upon numerical disclosure in a specified format of the representation of predefined groups on an issuer's board and within its executive officer population. This seeks to create easily comparable disclosure across issuers. On the other hand, is a model that requires comprehensive qualitative disclosure of an issuer's approach to addressing diversity within the organization, which is rooted in the belief that corporate governance practices and policies, including those addressing diversity, should be designed and implemented by each issuer in light of its strategy and business. Today's discussion is intended to highlight how the implementation of a disclosure model can fundamentally impact the development of corporate governance practices and outcomes in respect of diversity, as well as identifying the critical aspects of each of the two proposals and driving home the importance of feedback from all of you as the CSA determines the right course of action in implementing enhanced diversity disclosure requirements. I will now turn it over to Jennifer Smith, Senior Legal Counsel in the Office of the General Counsel, and Nicole Law, Senior Securities Analyst in our Corporate Finance Division. Their goal is to leave all of you with a clear understanding of the potential road ahead, how it will impact issuers and stakeholders, and the importance of expressing your views through the comment process.
Thanks, Samir, and good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer, and I'm joined by my colleague, Nicole. We are both members of the CSA Diversity Committee, which has been involved in drafting the proposed diversity amendments. As Samir has noted, today we are going to talk about the CSA proposed amendments to Form 58-101 F1 Corporate Governance Disclosure of National Instrument 58-101 Disclosure of Corporate Governance Practices and proposed changes to National Policy 58-201 Corporate Governance Guidelines, which were published on April 13th, 2023. Before we get started, if you could please note the following disclaimers. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A button that is located at the bottom of the screen. We will be answering these questions along with questions that were submitted in advance at the end of the discussion. We will attempt to answer as many questions as possible, but if we are unable to get to your question, please provide your email address when submitting your question so we can get back to you, or you can reach us after the presentation. Our contact information will be provided at the end. The CSA believes that diversity on boards and among executive officer positions is important. Individuals with diverse backgrounds present diverse perspectives, ideas, and experiences. Further, the CSA recognizes it is important to investors to be provided with diversity disclosure information so they are able to make informed investment and voting decisions. Your feedback will help determine how the CSA proceeds with amending corporate governance disclosure. So we strongly encourage you to submit a comment letter providing feedback on which elements of disclosure would best meet the needs of stakeholders. We will provide the details on how to submit a comment letter at the end of the presentation.
In recent years, there has been a push for increased diversity on corporate boards and among executive officer positions beyond women. In 2021, in recognition of the recent developments, CSA staff, including ASC staff, undertook a variety of consultations with stakeholders to better understand their needs and perspectives with respect to diversity beyond women. The consultations were held through a variety of forums, including, as mentioned by Samir, an ASC hosted virtual roundtable. The roundtable was comprised of corporate directors with varying backgrounds who discussed diversity beyond gender on boards and in executive officer ranks. The CSA consultations revealed that diversity is an important consideration in investment and voting decisions. There are also strong investor support for expanding the existing disclosure regime to consider diversity beyond women, while maintaining specific disclosure requirements for women. However, stakeholders supported different approaches to diversity disclosure. In particular, certain stakeholders indicated support for a consistent, standardized framework for diversity disclosure, whereas others stressed that a flexible approach would be better suited to Canada's diverse capital markets and expressed concerns with the disclosure of personal characteristics. In recognition of this feedback, the CSA has proposed two versions of Form 58-101 F1, reflecting the different approaches respecting diversity-related disclosures issuers must provide.
The proposed disclosure requirements would only be applicable to non-venture issuers and would not impact venture issuers at this time. Before discussing the two different approaches, we wanted to briefly address the disclosure currently required under the Canada Business Corporations Act, or CBCA, and how this impacts the proposed CSA diversity disclosure. As you may be aware, since January 1st, 2020, distributing corporations governed by the CBCA, including venture issuers, are required to provide their shareholders and Corporations Canada with information about the representation of women, Indigenous peoples, members of visible minorities, and persons with disabilities on their board of directors and among senior management. When we look at the impact of the CBCA requirements on reporting issuers in Canada, approximately 27% of TSX listed issuers are incorporated under the CBCA, meaning 73% of TSX listed reporting issuers are not incorporated under the CBCA and are therefore not required to provide this additional information. Here in Alberta, approximately 81% of TSX listed reporting issuers are not incorporated under the CBCA. Returning to the proposed CSA amendments, what changes can you expect? Certain things are staying the same. Both approaches to diversity disclosure build upon existing disclosure requirements. The proposed amendments would retain the current disclosure requirements regarding the representation of women on boards and in executive officer positions. The current comply or explain disclosure model would continue to apply with respect to policies for women on boards and targets for women on boards and in executive officer positions. The most significant change arising from the proposed amendments is that non-venture issuers would be required to disclose aspects of diversity beyond the representation of women, the specifics of which Nicole will discuss next. The proposed disclosure requirements would only be applicable to non-venture issuers and would not impact venture issuers at this time. However, the proposed changes to the guidelines would apply to both non-venture and venture issuers. As a reminder, the guidelines are not prescriptive.
As previously mentioned, the CSA unanimously agrees that diversity is valuable and the inclusion of diversity in corporate governance disclosures is important to providing investors with transparency in voting and investing decisions. However, there are two different perspectives, as informed by the consultation feedback, on how the increased transparency related to diversity disclosures can be attained. One approach, referred to as Form B, contemplates mandatory reporting on the representation of 5 designated and defined groups on boards and in executive officer positions. These groups consist of women, Indigenous peoples, racialized persons, and persons with disabilities, and LGBTQ 2SI+ persons. As this approach mandates disclosure on historically underrepresented groups, it is generally aligned with the reporting requirements pursuant to the CBCA. The only difference is that the Form B approach requires disclosure of people who self-identify as LGBTQ 2SI+ persons. To promote consistency and comparability of disclosures, all data would be required to be reported in standardized tabular format. On the other hand, the approach referred to as Form A is predicated upon the view that securities regulators should not select categories of diversity other than women, preferring to leave that to the issuer's determination as to what aspects of diversity are most beneficial to that issuer in advancing its business and strategy. Another feature of this approach is that it requires issuers to look at diversity beyond the board of directors with the aim to build talent pipelines that strengthen company culture, whereas Form B excludes executive officers from disclosure on the consideration of diversity when making executive officer appointments and talent management decisions. This approach may also avoid the obligation to inquire about personal characteristics of board members and executive officers, as well as limitations on the completeness of the disclosure arising from the use of information resulting from voluntary self-identification in relation to the specified categories. Some issuers may have concerns that the Form A diversity disclosure requirements may not be clear, thereby making it challenging for issuers to provide quality disclosure. However, during our corporate governance disclosure reviews, we note that a number of reporting issuers are already taking the initiative of voluntarily disclosing their diversity beyond women initiatives. And there are several examples of high quality disclosures in this area. The CSA recognizes the importance of diversity on boards and among executive officers' positions. Disclosures provide investors with decision useful information that enables them to better understand how diversity is addressed by the issuer. Your feedback regarding the two proposals is critically important as it will assist the CSA in determining the right course of action in implementing enhanced diversity disclosure requirements.
We hope that you have found this information session useful, and we encourage you to submit a comment letter. The final form and guidelines that will be adopted will be based on feedback received during the consultation period. Please send your comments to each of these addresses, and they will be forwarded to the other participating jurisdictions. As previously stated, your written feedback will be instrumental in shaping the path the CSA takes with respect to diversity disclosure. We therefore encourage you to submit a comment letter expressing your views. Thank you for your time this morning.
Great. So to kick off the Q&A session, we received a few questions in advance of this morning's information session. So to begin with, we will start with looking at these. The first question submitted was, we are a TSX listed company that is incorporated under the CBCA. Would either Form A or Form B result in double the disclosure requirements or conflicting requirements? So although Form B is more aligned with the CBCA requirements, if you adopted either Form B or Form A, there would be some additional disclosure requirements compared to what is required by the CBCA. But this would not result in double the requirements, and it is possible to comply with both forms. So TSX listed companies that are incorporated under the CBCA requirements can integrate disclosures applicable to the CBCA as well as the proposed new requirements. So the second question we received was, I have concerns with requiring directors and executive officers to self-identify under designated groups. Has the CSA considered privacy implications?
I can answer this one if you'd like, Nicole. Yes, this is a concern that the CSA considered when developing the proposed amendments. Both forms contemplate voluntary self-disclosure by directors and executive officers. However, one of the key differences is that Form B requires mandatory reporting on the representation of 5 defined designated groups. So an issuer must inquire of its directors and executives whether they self-identify in any of the 5 categories. And if one or more board members or executive officers choose to disclose that they self-identify as one of these 5 designated groups, this must be reported in the prescribed table. On the other hand, Form A does not mandate data disclosure about members of groups other than women. So disclosure is only required to the extent that an issuer chooses to collect such data.
And then the next question that we received in advance was, why is the CSA requiring diversity disclosure? Is this the responsibility of the securities regulator, or is it better left to the marketplace to drive this change? So the ASC's mandate is to protect investors and to foster a fair and efficient capital market. That includes trying to ensure investors have the information they need to make informed investment and voting decisions. The CSA conducted consultations with a variety of stakeholders in 2021 to better understand their needs and perspectives with respect to diversity disclosure, including diversity disclosure beyond the representation of women. The feedback we received from many investors, specifically institutional investors, was that they strongly supported expanding the existing diversity disclosure regime to consider diversity beyond women, since diversity was identified as an important consideration to them in their investment and voting decisions. Okay, so we'll see what questions have come in here. So the first question I'll give to you, Jen. It's the ASC has publicly backed Form A, which is viewed as the flexible approach compared to Form B. Does the ASC believe that Form A will lead to real change?
Thanks, Nicole. Well, the short answer is yes, but let me preface my response by saying that both forms reflect a recognition of the importance of this information to investors and an effort to advance diversity disclosure. Choosing one form or the other should not be interpreted as a difference in that regard. Rather, it's a difference in perspective in how best to achieve that objective and provide meaningful disclosure on this topic. With respect to Form A, the ASC believes that when a company focuses on how diversity fits into and drives its business strategy, diversity will then become an integral part of the of the company. So we focus on on disclosure that we hope will shed light on how the company thinks about diversity from a governance and strategy perspective. And we hope that this will result in meaningful deliberations, discussions, and decisions. We expect in the long run that companies that have adopted diversity as part of their business strategy will ultimately achieve enduring benefits.
Yeah, and I'll add on to your point, Jennifer, that during our corporate disclosure reviews, we identified a number of reporting issuers who are already taking the initiative to voluntarily disclose this diversity beyond women. So we're not concerned that a more flexible approach would result in companies not adopting the disclosure of broader diversity policies. The next question. Oh, here's one. Venture issuers are not captured under the proposed amendments. Are there plans to expand these requirements to the venture issuers at a future date?
I can take this one. So no decision has been made at this time. The notice and request for comment, it does include a consultation question as to whether the CSA should subsequently consider developing such disclosure requirements for venture issuers. And if so, should the requirements differ to reflect the circumstances of venture issuers? The CSA will make its decision based in part on the feedback that we do receive.
Next question. I don't think that the disclosure requirements go far enough. Why isn't the CSA setting targets?
I can answer this one too. Generally, with respect to the regulation of issuers, we rely heavily on ensuring investors have the information they need to make informed investment and voting decisions. That is the focus of the proposed rules. We have received feedback from a number of investors supporting this position. So the proposed amendments maintain a disclosure-based regime. We believe that issuers are best positioned to assess if and how they should set targets, because a one-size-fits-all approach is difficult to formulate. And issuers who choose to use targets will need to apply different criteria in establishing targets appropriate for their particular company.
Okay. Here's one on board nominations. So I'm unclear what disclosures the CSA is looking for in regards to a composition matrix. Can you clarify? Are you looking for disclosure of an individual director's skill set or the issuer's composition matrix in general? So the composition matrix would set out a mix of the skills, experience, competencies, knowledge, and attributes that the board as a whole either currently has or is looking to achieve in the future as part of its membership. And here's another one. Proxy advisors are mandating quotas for women on board of directors. Why is the CSA not doing the same?
Well, different investors may have differing views on whether targets and quotas are appropriate, and if so, at what level. Again, we see our role here as making sure investors have the information they need to make informed investing and voting decisions. The CSA's approach requires an issuer to mindfully consider how it addresses diversity within its organization, which an issuer may conclude involves setting quotas. We believe that this attention to a company's policies and processes will lead to lasting better governance.
It looks like we've had a few questions on this theme, so I'll answer this next one. In responding to the request for comment, are stakeholders required to choose between Form A or Form B? So we are interested in getting your feedback as to which of the two approaches best meets the needs of investors and the issuers. But we do welcome feedback. So if your opinion is neither of the forms, or if you prefer one element from either or both forms, then we would recommend providing that in your feedback, as that is something that we are interested in knowing. Here's another one. I'm going to give this one to you, Jen. It's unclear that Form B would require the disclosure of designated groups. However, I'm not clear as to whether Form A also requires this disclosure.
Okay, so the question's whether Form B requires the disclosure of designated groups. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So under Form A, an issuer is only required to identify groups that the issuer concludes are part of its business strategy. It is neither required to utilize or limited to the consideration of the designated groups. So even if an issuer identifies a group, it does not need to disclose data as to the representation of that group on the board or executive officer ranks unless it actually collects that data.
So there's a few more questions coming in, but it looks like they're all similar themes to what we've gone through here. If you haven't received an answer to your question, or if there's anything that you want to discuss in detail, please reach out to us. Our contact information was provided at the end of the presentation, and it's also been included at the back of the notice, so please reach out. At the end of this session, there will be a quick 1-minute survey. We would greatly appreciate your feedback if you have any. And with that, I will end the presentation. Thank you for joining us this morning.